Good afternoon and welcome to a brand spanking new segment titled In Conversation With, a segment specially designed to showcase the backstories of individuals who have made an impact. Now, who can resist an hour of convo over a cup of tea on a Saturday afternoon? Well, during this hour, we will delve into a conversation around stories that need to be told of modern-day icons. Luminary Learning Solutions crafted this segment so you, our audience, can be inspired to truly thrive. I'm Thayalan, the Chief Evangelist and co-host this hour, and I'm being joined in by our founder and destiny architect, Nathavitharana, the host for the afternoon. And together we will take you through an hour of free-flowing discussion. So get ready, sit back, and enjoy the conversation. For today's segment on In Conversation With, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Major General Craig B. Whelden, U.S. Army retired, a global Fortune 500 speaker, a three-time award-winning #1 international best-selling author of Leadership, The Art of Inspiring People to Be Their Best. Craig's leadership journey started when he became an Eagle Scout at age 14. 30 years later, he was the youngest general in the United States Army. Combined with another 9 years as a member of senior executive service with the U.S. Marine Corps, he has over 17 years at the highest levels of the U.S. military, leading thousands of soldiers, sailors, Marines, and civilians, while serving 10 years in Europe and another 12 in Pacific. His book and his presentations have educated, motivated, energized, and inspired thousands around the world to be their very best. So on that note, Major General Craig Whelden, good day and thank you for joining us today, sir.
Well, Anton and Vidusha, it's a pleasure for me to join you on the other side of the world.
Well, let's kick this conversation off, and I'm dying to find out, in this illustrious career of yours, how did you join the Army? Why, I should say.
Well, I grew up in an Air Force family, and my father was stationed in Europe when I was in high school. So 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, I was in either Paris, France, or Mons, Belgium. When it came time to pick a college, I didn't really know where to go because I hadn't been in the United States for many years. So I ended up going to Purdue University, where my father went, and I applied for an Army Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship. And that's a military program in the university that helps prepare you for military service. Because I got a scholarship, I was obligated to give back 4 years to the Army. And so when I graduated from college, I went into the Army for 4 years to give my time back. My plan was to get out of the Army and go do something else. But before I knew it, 4 years turned into 30 years, and I ended up staying for much longer than I initially expected.
What made you get into it? I mean, is it because you come from a military family, or is it something else?
Well, I think it was a combination of things. My father served in the military. I grew up as a military child, traveling all over the world, and they paid my way through college because the scholarship I got, I don't know that I would have been able to go to college had I not had that scholarship. So that kind of kept me in the program in college, and then my obligation to pay back 4 years afterwards. I ended up liking what I was doing. And as I said, 4 years turned into 30 years.
Indeed. What made that switch? What made you like it so much? what is it about the army that lured you in, even after your obligatory 4 years were done?
Yeah, so there's a special brotherhood, I think, and now a sisterhood, because when I joined, there were fewer women than there are today. But there's a camaraderie in the military which you seldom find other places, because you have such a great dependence on each other. I initially was a tank platoon leader. I had 5 tanks and 20 soldiers, and I spent much of my time with them, particularly when we were out on field training. The training was exciting. The camaraderie was heartwarming for me. And, you know, after 4 years, I thought, let me give this another 3 years. And after that, I said, let me give this another 3 years. And then pretty soon, 10 years turned into 30 years. It just seemed to go by.
But there is something about the military, as you said, which is deeply rooted in camaraderie. But lots of people associate the military with physical prowess, and what I think don't get mentioned often enough is the mental resilience and the aptitude one needs to have to be a soldier as well as a leader in the military. Take us through some salient points on that, because I honestly think it's a mental thing as much as a physical thing. The physical aspect everyone sees. I mean, you can see the difference in a military person, obviously, because you're physically fit. What you don't understand is the mental fitness that goes along with it.
So you're training soldiers who are in the military. We have an all voluntary force in the military now. That's been the way it has been since I joined in 1973. We haven't had a draft since the Vietnam War. So everybody who joins is a volunteer. And after their initial commitment, they can leave or they can elect to stay. Many of them come in because they feel like they want to give back to their country. And so there's a sense of selfless service to the nation. People do that in different ways. People who join the medical field do it because they want to give back. People who join the fire department, people who join the police department, many of them do it because they want to serve their community, serve their nation, serve their fellow man. And I think there's a lot of that in the military as well. Ultimately, the military's use is to fight and win a nation's wars. And so you put these soldiers under tremendous stress when needed, and you have to have them combined in such a way as a team that they perform. And they do it because of instinct, they do that because of training, and they do that because of the leadership that they have bringing them along. I once worked for a 3-star general. He was a consummate gentleman. He never raised his voice in anger. He was very, very bright. He was very, very smart. He was very organized. He was a great leader. And a colonel came up to me one time and said, you know, General so-and-so is the toughest guy I have ever worked for. And I thought, why is that? So I asked him, why is that? He's such a gentleman. And he said, because I never wanted to disappoint him. Now let that soak in for a moment. That general demonstrated such inspirational leadership that colonel, and quite frankly, everybody in the organization, because I was in the organization, I was his deputy at the time, I was a 2-star general, and everybody who got up and went to work that day wanted to do the very best they possibly could, because they didn't want to disappoint their leader, because their leader inspired them. And the worst thing that could happen to them was for that general to say, you know, you really didn't do a good job, or you failed this time. That would be more crushing than what people typically associate with military leadership as pounding the fist and yelling and screaming and all that sort of thing. I'm here to tell you that doesn't work any more in the military than it does in civilian life. That the best possible leader you can have is someone who keeps their cool, keeps their calm demeanor throughout a crisis, and everybody wants to follow because they know they will lead them to the right place.
Just to follow up, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm just thinking along the lines of what you just said. You know, I'm beginning to understand that there is a chapter in your book that talks about character being the leadership's basic building block. Could you expand on that based on the story that you just told us and your experience in itself?
Sure. When I wrote the book, I ended up with 24 chapters, and I hired an editor, and he said to me, which of these 24 chapters is the most important? And I said, character. Character is the basic foundational building block for great leaders. And then he said, well, then that should be chapter 1. And I said, okay, so that's why it's chapter 1, because it's the most important aspect of a great leader. Now, character is kind of a catch-all term. It's an umbrella term for many, many different kinds of traits, which include ambition, perseverance, self-awareness, empathy, humility, honesty, trust, integrity, charisma, and always taking responsibility of being a leader, often while subordinating your own personal interests. So if you take all these different aspects of strong character and you put them together, that's really the foundation. And I think if you don't have that, if you don't have a strength of character, then you are going to fail at some point in your life. And we have seen that time and time again with senior leaders who, for whatever reason, got to wherever they are in their career, and they are now a very senior leader, but they didn't have the strength of character as a foundation, and they started to fall apart because they didn't have the right integrity, they didn't have the trust, they didn't have honesty, all these kinds of things that are important to give you the foundational aspects of great leadership.
Can I just butt in there? Because I think when people talk of character, and we have a misnomer in that sometimes we mistake having good character or strong character to being a nice guy. But there is a paradox in that, isn't it? It's not just being a nice guy, it's also being able to be driven, to be able to be taking those tough calls when required. And lots of the time, exactly what you talked about, where you're seen to never lose your temper and always having that right demeanor, can be misunderstood for weakness of character, and you don't really know when to put your foot down. And there's always that dichotomy, isn't it? And that's something that I think lots of people miss. You don't have to be nasty or outwardly aggressive to be firm and decisive.
Yes. Yeah. No, you are absolutely right, Vidusha. Let me give you an example. When I was a battalion commander, I had 1,000 soldiers. That was in the early 1990s. And for your listeners, a battalion is organized in a hierarchical structure with a leader at the top, and then he had subordinate units underneath him. They were called companies, and there were captains who had been in the military. I had been in the military about 15 or 16 years at the time. My captains had been in the Army for maybe 6 to 8 years. And I had one captain, company commander, in my organization that took that approach. He underestimated how important I valued the mission. And I came up to him one day and I said, you know, I think that you don't understand how serious I am sometimes. And if I need to be, I can be very ugly. And you don't want to see that. You really don't want to see that. And then for about 30 seconds, I turned that switch on. And then after 30 seconds, I turned the switch off. And I said, see, there are two kinds of approaches here. One is that you can follow me and follow my instructions because you are inspired and you understand and you appreciate the collective good of what I'm trying to do here. Or I can put my finger in your chest in ways that you won't appreciate, and we'll get there one way or the other. I would much prefer to do it the other way than this way. And he said, I understand. And from that point on, we were just fine. So a leader needs to be able to use the tools in his kit bag that are appropriate for the time and the situation. But most of the time, if he's effective, if he has the strength of character, and he's an effective leader, he doesn't need to use those tools because people will follow him anyway.
And one of the things I think is fantastic about the entire leadership hierarchy in the military, I think one of the, again, misunderstood paradoxes is that most people think that the hierarchy in the military is so rigid, very, very affirmative and backed by tradition as much as protocol. So disobeying an order is really not an option. However, one of my former friends and colleagues and mentors, who was himself in the army for quite a long while, told me, Vidusha, maybe that is true, but please understand, the senior you get, the smaller the gun that you carry. Yeah? So please understand that if you really don't live by example and people follow you willingly, it's very easy for some stray bullet to hit you, which was not really meant for the enemy.
Right.
So I think people misunderstand leadership to be hierarchical in the military, but it is very much earned, isn't it?
Yeah. So let me give you a story. We had a very, very famous 4-star general in the Marine Corps who never married. He was a bachelor. And he was a 1-star general at the time this incident occurred. But on Christmas Eve, he went into his organization to see the duty officer, because there's always a duty officer, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 360. There's an officer on duty at the organization all the time, and it's a rotating extra duty. So he went in to see this lieutenant who was the duty officer at the time, and that lieutenant had a wife and 2 kids, and he was on duty for Christmas Day. And the 1-star general said, go home and spend time with your family. I'll take your duty today. So this 1-star general became the duty officer for this organization because he didn't have a family to go back to, but he knew that this lieutenant had a family to go back to. And he let that lieutenant go back to see his family. If you don't treat people with dignity and respect, they will leave. They will find something else to do. They'll find greener pastures somewhere else. And so as I got more senior in the military, I reminded myself often that if the young lieutenant or the young captain or the young private or the young sergeant, if they aren't treated well and treated with respect and inspired to stay, they will leave. And I may be, if I don't treat them the right way, if I don't treat them with dignity and respect, they may go find something else to do. And they may be very, very talented, but they'll apply those talents somewhere else. Because we did have a volunteer military, and they could elect after their term was up to leave and go do something else. Sometimes senior leaders forget that. And so you'll find the effective leader walking the talk, which is a metaphor that we use in the United States. They go walk the talk. They will go find they'll go find the junior soldier and check on him frequently. When I ran a base, I was a colonel, and I had a base of 45,000 people. I had about 3,000 employees, and it was in Germany, and it was scattered all over Bavaria in the southern part of Germany. And I used to tell my subordinate commanders, I'm going to come visit your organization once a week. at least. I'll try to get out of the office and come visit. I had 4 different organizations. I'll try to, and I want you to point me towards an employee in your organization at the lowest possible level who has done very, very well. So I can go tell them how much I appreciate them. And I would go seek that person out and say, look, I have heard about the wonderful job that you are doing here in the motor pool, or here in the dining facility, or here in the child care center, or in the housing office, or wherever it happened to be. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate what you do for us. And then I would give them a commander's coin. And a commander's coin is a coin, I don't know if you have the ability to see this, but this is a commander's coin. And this was my Marine Corps coin when I was a senior executive in the Marine Corps. And on the front, it has the Marine Corps logo, and on the back, it has my senior executive service flag and my title and my name and so on and so forth. And I would give them this coin and say, keep this coin as recognition from me of the wonderful work that you do for the organization.
Sorry, that little gesture, being at that high level and going all the way down to the junior most person and thanking him personally. I have, I guess, 2 questions to ask you on that, sir. One being, what prompted you to do that? I mean, I'm sure you've had a busy schedule and you must be packed all the time, but for you to take that time to go right down to the grassroots level, what prompted you to do that? But also at the same time, I want to know, in the Army, while there is discipline and everything, how important is mentoring? I mean, is that something that's practiced? Is there an importance to that?
Yeah. So let me go to the first thing. Let me tell another story. When I was a battalion commander and I had 1,000 soldiers, about half of them were married, which means about 500. And of the 500 or so that were married, maybe half of those had children. And during the 2 years that I was a commander, there were a number of births in our organization. So I told my sergeant major, who was a senior enlisted guy in the organization, I said, whenever there is a birth in our organization, I want to know who it is, and I want to send a letter to the baby. And it will be dated the day of that birth. And it will go something like this. Dear John, let's assume the baby's name is John. Dear John, I just want you to know that your father is doing a tremendous job in the 1st Battalion, 10th Cavalry. And you can be very, very proud of the service to his nation and to the service to his organization. Now, it was a sort of a stock letter that I signed, and I put it in an envelope, and I put a stamp on it, and we sent it out. And I don't know, maybe over 2 years, I sent 20 or 30 of those out because there were 20 or 30 births. But when we had an organizational day and the families came in, I had mothers coming up to me in tears, telling me how much they appreciated this letter. The very first letter their baby ever got was from their husband's battalion commander, and it was dated the day of the birth. And they said it's the first thing in his baby book, or I put it in a frame and it's hanging on the wall in the baby's room, and so forth. Those are so easy things to do that reaches all the way down to the bottom of your organization and tell people how much they're appreciated. And those are the kinds of things people remember for a very, very long time. Let me, if I can, tell another story. When I was a lieutenant at Fort Hood, Texas, in 1974, I married my college sweetheart, and she was wonderful. She was beautiful. She was wonderful. She was everything that I could possibly imagine. And 2 years later, she left me, and I was absolutely crushed. It was the first major failure that I had had in my lifetime. And I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know who to turn to, and I didn't know what I was going to do to keep my sanity. So the way I dealt with that is I just stayed at work, because the last thing I wanted to do was go home and stare at empty walls. So I was a battalion maintenance officer for a tank battalion at the time, and my office was in the motor pool. We had 58 tanks. We had another 50 or so vehicles. My responsibility was to make sure they were running well. So one Friday night, about 7:30 in the evening, on a Friday night, the weekend was approaching, I was down in the motor pool in my office doing paperwork, and in walks the battalion commander, Colonel Jack Woodmansey. I'm sorry, the brigade commander. Now, Colonel Woodmansey was about 5 levels above me. He had 4,000 soldiers in his organization, and I was only one of them. We had never met until that day. And I thought, what a perfect storm of bad luck. Here I am sitting in the motor pool, and I've got all these personal problems, and now the brigade commander is going to inspect the motor pool at 7 o'clock on a Friday night. He said, "Lieutenant, let's go take a walk in the motor pool." So I got up from my desk and we walked up and down the tank line for about 20 to 25 minutes. And he never said a word about the maintenance condition of our tanks or the appearance of our tanks. He never said a word about my personal problems. All he talked about were the challenges that he had faced in his life and how he had overcome them. And when we got back to the front gate of the motor pool, he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, "There's light at the end of this tunnel. You just can't see it yet. Have a great weekend." And I can tell you, he took me out of the depths of despair and brought me up because he demonstrated that a senior leader cared about somebody who was very, very far down in his organization, who he had never met before. But my boss had told him about this good lieutenant who was going through some personal challenges, and he could use some bucking up and a little help. And that's why Colonel Woodmansey came down that night. Now, there are 2 follow-on stories to this story. The first one is that I left Fort Hood about 4 or 5 months later, and I went to Fort Knox, Kentucky to attend a school. And while I was at that school, I met Karen Lusk, who now has been my wife for 43 years. And I cannot imagine life having been different than it is. I have 2 wonderful children. I have the finest grandchild on the planet. And I can't imagine life turning out differently. Now, I couldn't see that in 1976. But in 1977, I started a new journey in my life, which I couldn't see. I could not see the light at the end of the tunnel at that time. And it turned out just fine. The other story is that about 8 years later, I was a battalion commander. I've already mentioned that. And I was at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I learned that retired 3-star General Jack Woodmansey was coming to Fort Knox. So I called the protocol office and I said to them, "Look, I used to work for then Colonel Woodmansey, now General Woodmansey, 8 years ago when I was a lieutenant. I would love to have him come over and speak to my officers about leadership. Would you ask him if he would be willing to do that?" They did. He agreed. He came over. And when I introduced him by telling my officers that story. I said, "You know, Jack Woodmansey, General Woodmansey, is one of the reasons that I stayed in the Army. And I am where I am today." And this was in 1989 or 1990. And of course, that was 30 years ago. And I've been associated with the military ever since. But it's the Jack Woodmanseys of the Army that kept me in. And hopefully it's the Craig Wheldens that kept other people in. Effective leaders demonstrate that they care about everybody in their organization.
Wow.
Now,
Can I just probe you on the follow-up of that with what Anton asked? I think it's you don't necessarily associate that kind of intimacy in the Army, isn't it? I mean, one would like to think that it's a rather cold relationship and a very command and control type of relationship that one has, and that's clearly not the case. Can I just probe on the mentorship as well? That's a classic
Sure.
example of mentoring without I mean, the mentoring that we are used to is so structured and so organized, and it's a conversation half an hour that you slot into your calendar and you do out of compulsion. But the kind of mentoring that happens in the military is much more subtle, isn't it? And yes, there is the formal mentoring process of one of your juniors, but also there's a lot more, like the examples you cited just now, a lot more subtle mentoring that happens. And your personal story is a classic example of that.
So Colonel Woodmansey, General Woodmansey, was a mentor of mine, and he didn't even know it. He didn't know it because I was picking up the habits that he used to effectively lead when I was a lieutenant that I carried with me for the rest of my career and, quite frankly, for the rest of my life. I've got a chapter in my book called Are You My Mentor? That's the title of the chapter. And I like to say that there are 4 types of mentors. They're assigned. In other words, Vishram, I am assigning you to be Anton's mentor. There is self-appointed. Vishram says, I'm going to be your mentor, Anton. There is sought after. Anton seeks you to be his mentor. And all of those work. Sometimes they work more effectively than others. Certainly if it's assigned, it may be less effective than if it was sought after or self-appointed. There's another one which I have found very, very valuable, which is not a formal designation, but I call virtual, a virtual mentor. And what do I mean by that? Imagine, if you will, going through your career or going through your life as walking down a path. And along the path, there are rocks. And each of the rocks represent either good things that you experience or bad things that you experience. What I tell people is pick those rocks up and put them in your backpack. Pick up the good ones and put them there, and pick up the bad ones and put them in there. Pick up the good ones to remind you of the things you thought, wow, that is really, really good. If I ever get to be that level, I hope that I'm like that. Pick up the bad things, because as you experience bad things, you can say, I'm going to remember this so that if I ever get to that position, I never act like that. I suspect most of your listeners have been walking down, all of your listeners have been walking down a path, a metaphorical path, their entire life, their entire career. Sometimes they don't pick up these rocks. And what I'm saying is, when you see things that strike you as exceptionally good and also exceptionally bad, don't forget them. Remember them, because as you become more senior, you want to pull those good rocks out and say, I want to use this technique, this tactic, or this procedure, because it really worked well 20 years ago. Colonel Woodmansey coming down to the motor pool and talking to me that Friday night at 7 o'clock is a good rock that I put in my rucksack and carried with me the rest of my life. And that's the reason I did things like the baby letter when I was a battalion commander, and the coin trips when I was a base commander. And when I was on a ship as a 2-star general, I was a chief of staff of a Navy Joint Task Force. And we had a command ship that was based in Japan. And we did exercises out in the Pacific Ocean. Now, I'm an Army guy on a Navy ship. I'm the second senior guy on the ship. The 4-star admiral was the senior guy, and I was his chief of staff. But I would carve out about 2 hours every day when I was on that ship and just go roam around the ship by myself, talking to sailors and telling the sailors how much I appreciated what they were doing for us to keep us safe and keep us effectively out on the ocean, using the communications that they set up and everything else. Everything that they were doing to make our life easy was much appreciated. And I suspect there are many sailors who are still telling the story about this Army general out in the middle of the Pacific thing that came into the mess hall, the dining facility, or down into the engine room, or, you know, these places. I would intentionally go find the places that most senior leaders would not go so that I could be seen there. That's really the rock that I put in my rucksack with Colonel Woodmansey in 1976 that I've used over and over and over again Who knows? A young sailor or a young officer may become the leader of his service someday if he's treated with dignity, respect, and he likes what he does because he's led well and you keep him in. It's the same thing for an organization of any kind, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. Surround yourself with good people, treat them very, very well, and you'll be amazed at the sort of things that they do. The leader only has 24 hours in a day, just like everybody else, but he ought to spend a good portion of that as a cheerleader for his team.
Sure.
Thank you. Just a quick note to those who've joined in. We are in conversation with Major General Craig Whelden, U.S. Army retired, a global Fortune 500 speaker, a 3-time award-winning #1 international best-selling author. This is an hour designed to bring inspiration through the backstories of modern-day icons and modern-day leaders. On that note, you've talked about communicating with individuals and commanding not just hundreds but thousands of individuals. But in your view, what is the importance of an effective communication? Because I guess in the army, it's quite easy to just give out instructions and understand that people would follow them, as opposed to what we have in the corporate world today. And in the corporate world, the communication is never taken that seriously in terms of being effective. But in your opinion, the importance of solid, effective communication, sir?
Yeah, so first of all, when a new leader joins an organization, I think it's very important for the leader to tell the organization what he thinks or she thinks is important, what direction the organization should take, and even little personal quirks that they have. Let me illustrate that with another story. I went into an organization one time. I was the deputy, and I was a 2-star general, and the boss was a 3-star general, and he was brand new. And he came into the organization, and on the first day he had a staff meeting that was supposed to start at 9 o'clock in the morning. He went into the conference room, he sat down at the head of the table. People started coming in 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 3 minutes before the meeting was about to start. There was a clock on the wall at the far end of the room. And when that second hand hit 9 o'clock, he turned to his aide and he said, "Lock the door." So his aide locked the door. Now there were 2 staff officers who were not in the room yet. And when they showed up 2 or 3 minutes later, they couldn't get in the room. And they knocked, thinking, hey, somebody will open the door. And this new boss said, "Don't open the door." So he was sending a signal. He was sending a message that punctuality is important to him. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with punctuality. I think it's important. It's a sign of discipline. If the meeting starts at 9 o'clock, then it starts at 9 o'clock. Everybody should be there. But I don't know that that was the most effective way to communicate that to the organization by locking 2 senior officers out of the door and out of the meeting. So what do? When I go into an organization on the very first day, I have a briefing that I give called Whelden on Whelden, and that's a reflection of myself. For anybody who reads my book, they will find that in Appendix B of my book. The briefing that I used to give, Whelden on Whelden, is in my book. It's Appendix B. Appendix A is my philosophy of command. And when I became a battalion commander, I sat down at my kitchen table and I wrote out what I thought was important. And I issued that on the very first day. And that was 1989, over 30 years ago. And that is in my book as well. And I can tell you I live by those same principles today that I did over 30 years ago. So between the philosophy of command and the briefing I gave Whelden on Whelden, I told everybody, this is who I am. These are my strengths. These are my weaknesses. And I would admit those up front. And these are what I think are non-negotiable principles. So more to your question about effective communications. If you have a message to give to somebody, and this doesn't just apply to the military, it applies in your daily life for anybody. If you have a message that you're going to give to somebody, I would tell you that in most cases, you can send that message to a 6-year-old or a 60-year-old. You can send it to a male or a female. You can send it to an American or a foreigner, a conservative or a liberal. It doesn't matter who the audience is, but you need to understand how your message is going to be received by the other party and then communicate that message in terms that they understand. I have a briefing that I give or a talk that I give, and in my talk, I talk about effective communications. And when I was still in the military, I asked my lawyer, my IT person, the technical person, internet technical person, and my doctor to come in and give me a short paragraph describing something in their field that they would understand easily, but most people who weren't in their field wouldn't understand. And most of you can relate to this. You've read legal documents that you cannot understand. You've heard medical terminology that you have no idea what it is. You've heard IT people talk to each other in terms that's like a foreign language. So I said to all three of these people, give me something, short paragraph, in terms that you understand, that people in your field will understand, but most of us, rest of us, will not understand. And then I will ask you to translate that into plain English that the average man on the street will understand. And so in my presentation, I throw that up on the screen and I said, anybody in the medical field here in the audience? And if there's a hand that goes up, I said, do you understand what that is? And oftentimes they will say, yes, I do. And then I ask everybody else, do you understand? And most people don't. And then I throw up the translation. It's exactly the same thing said in two different ways. And it's because the first thing you do when you communicate, either to a person or to a group, is to do a quick analysis of who it is that's going to receive your message, whatever it is, and then communicate that in terms that they understand.
Thank you for that. And honestly, I just want to veer in to a completely different thing, because I think it connects up all the dots you've been speaking about. All of this is fantastic under normal circumstances, especially for us, because in our organizations, I guess we can afford to make mistakes. And yes, there are consequences to that mistake, but it's nothing compared to the consequences that you would have in the army. And I want to move in there because I think if you're a leader in the army and you made a mistake, it costs lives. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's very difficult, obviously. We try to train. First of all, we recognize that mistakes can be made. Let me tell a short story. When I was a lieutenant, and I was a tanker, I was an armor officer, and we were out training, doing live fire training on a range. We had, I was the night officer in charge of the range, and we had tanks on the firing line, and we had a tank up on top of a hill that was shining a searchlight onto the targets, so that the tanks that were firing could see the target and that they would fire at them. Well, the tank that was up on the hill, battery died, and he couldn't start the tank, so the light couldn't come on. So we sent a second tank up there to park next to the tank that was dead and started using that tank. And after a while, that was working fine until I got this frantic call on the telephone or on the radio that the tank is on fire. And I'm in a tower that's about 300-400 meters away, and all I could see up on top of the hill was flames. And pretty soon this young soldier ran up into the tower telling me that the tank is on fire. And in fact, what had happened is when they tried to start the tank, there was a short and it caught the fuel on fire and it started the tank on fire. They pulled the fire extinguishers, they didn't work, and pretty soon we had a tank on fire, and the wind was blowing in such a way that the next tank caught on fire. Now, you wouldn't think that a tank that is metal could burn, I am here to tell you it can. It can burn. And so that night at 3 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Whelden, the officer in charge of this live fire training range, had 2 tanks burning up on top of the hill, a long way from any fire trucks. And even when the fire trucks got out there, they couldn't get up on top of the hill to put the fire out because it was on top of a hill and only tanks could go up there. So I had to tell my battalion commander that he just lost 2 of his 58 tanks because they burned to the ground. Now there was an investigation and they determined what the cause of the fire was and everything else. But I survived that event professionally because we understand that mistakes made in training you can learn from, you can survive, and you can continue to succeed. And I did, because I stayed in the Army for another 29 years and retired as a 2-star general. We used to have this concept called 0 defects. And it was not an official term, but 0 defects means you can't make mistakes. And if you do make mistakes, you're done, you're finished, you're over. And we realized how toxic that was and how destructive that was in the early 80s. So we introduced a thing called after action reviews, and it is part of our DNA now. In the early 80s, when we went out to train, when we went out on an operation, when it was completed, we would gather everybody together and we would conduct an after action review. And the first thing that the leader would do was stand up and say, "Let me tell you what I did wrong today." And here's the leader admitting to his own mistakes in front of his organization. And that's the way we always started an after action review. And what that did, it gave license to everybody else in the organization to do the same thing. Because the only way you can learn from your mistakes is to recognize them and to acknowledge them and work on them. After action reviews are anathema to some armies in the military, particularly the old Soviet Union. When we started doing this, and even some of the European armies were aghast. They were amazed that we would have senior leaders stand up and admit in front of their soldiers that they made mistakes and did things wrong. And our principle that we lived by was the only way you can fix things is to admit them and to recognize them and then to repair them so that you don't make those same mistakes again. And it now is part of the military culture, has been for 30 years in the United States. And you can apply those same principles to your daily life. You can apply them to your business, your nonprofit. You can say, okay, we just did event X. Let's get together and talk about what went right and what went wrong. And I'm going to start this off as your leader by telling you the mistakes that I made. And it's amazing how that will bring out from everybody else truth and honesty and an effort to try to make things better.
How do you prep leaders for that, though? Not so much owning up to that mistake, and of course, very familiar with the work you did, because I did a research paper on this some time ago for some of the work that I was doing professionally. But something that I always I wondered about was, how do you prepare leadership inside the organization of a military to also be emotionally stable enough to live with some of the mistakes you've made? Because it's horrendous, isn't it? Sometimes when you make a bad judgment call and you see battalions wiped out because of the command you gave, especially on the ground, when you have to make a snap decision with very limited information. It's something emotionally very, very jarring. How do you prepare soldiers for that at a junior level and then pick up the pace when you become more senior? Because I think that's one of the things that we inside organizations need to prepare, of course, to a much lesser degree, but nevertheless prepare for, because you need to be able to live with your mistakes and learn from it. And for that, you need resilience. How do you prep them for that?
Well, in the military, we start by, when people join the military, we start training them that way, and teaching them that this is not a zero defects organization. We learn from mistakes. We get better by recognizing the mistakes that we make. Now, I won't say that every mistake that's made is forgivable. That's not always the case. There are egregious mistakes that cross a certain line. But in training, where we try to get people to be the best they possibly can be at the task that they've been given, that's the time to make mistakes. I'd rather have them sweat in training than bleed in combat.
Can I move into something very personal?
Sure.
Out of all this, was there ever a time where you sat down and asked yourself, is this worth it?
Oh, yes. Oh, sure. Absolutely. I think one of the fallacies and the things that some people don't recognize is that everybody's a human being. Everybody goes through challenges. Everybody goes through trying times. And I certainly have had those myself. I think probably at the 7 or 8 year point in my career in the military, I said to myself, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to continue on? And I had a talk with my wife, and we decided to give it another 3 years. And sometimes when you find yourself in an uncomfortable environment, and that environment can be a location, it can be the people that you're working with, it can be the organization that you're a part of, it can be the boss that you work for. If those situations, generally speaking, don't last forever. And so when you find yourself in a difficult place and you say, do I really want to do this? Part of my calculus is, how long will this continue? When will this change? If it's a location and I'm going to move, if it's a boss who's going to leave, if it's a job that I'm going to change, can I continue to do this until I see the light at the end of the tunnel? Because right now I'm in a dark place in the tunnel. So I've been in dark places in my tunnel many, many times. And I think junior people sometimes don't understand that. And how you deal with that is a test of your character, quite frankly. Do you have the perseverance, the determination to power through? Do you ask for help when you could use help? Let me tell another story, if I can. In 1999, my sister committed suicide on Christmas Eve. And I was on vacation in Hawaii with my parents at the time. It was Christmas dinner we were having with friends, and the phone rang at this friend's home. And it was the Army Operations Center. And they told me that they had just been notified by the American Red Cross that my sister had died. Now, this is Christmas night, 1999, and I'm at a dinner with friends, and my parents are with me, and my wife and my 2 kids. And when dinner was, I pulled my friend aside and I told him about the phone call. And then I pulled my wife aside and I told her about the phone call. And I said, when dinner is over, we're going to skip dessert. I want you to take the kids up to the bedroom, to the room in the hotel, and I'm going to take my parents for a walk. And so when dinner was over, we got up. My wife took the kids upstairs. I took my parents in a walk out on the hotel grounds. We found a bench to sit on underneath a big tree. And I told them that I had just gotten a phone call that their one and only daughter had died. And my mother fell off the bench onto the ground. And my father just sat there in stunned silence. And for the next week, we stayed in that hotel because my mother was so immobilized from this traumatic experience that she had just had that she couldn't travel. And we didn't even go back to Florida, which was 7,000 miles away because my sister, who had a very troubled life, was cremated. Now, I had a daughter who was about 14 years old at the time. So I said to the Army, you know, I've given 28 years of my life to the Army. I want to retire when I get to the 30-year point. And the Army tried to talk me out of that. And I said, you know, I need to figure out what's most important in my life. And it's not my military career, it's my family. So I'm going to put my family first. Let me spin off and tell another story if I can. A professor is standing at in a classroom, and he pulls out a basket and he puts the basket up on top of the table, and then he pulls a sack of he pulls a glass jar out and he puts it on the table. Then he pulls a basket of rocks and he starts putting the rocks into the glass jar one at a time until it fills to the top of the glass jar. And he turns to the class and he says, "Is the jar full?" And they say, "Yeah, the jar is full." So he then pulls out a bag of sand and he pours the sand into the glass jar, and all the sand granules go down amongst the rocks and to the bottom and then start to fill up until it gets up to the top of the glass jar. And he turns to the class and he says, "Is the jar full?" And they go, "Well, you fooled us the first time, but yeah, now the jar is full." So he pulls out a pitcher of water and he pours the water into the glass jar. And the water goes down amongst the rocks and amongst the sand, and it goes to the bottom and it fills up to the top. And he says to the class, "Is the jar full?" And they all go, "Well, we think it's full, but I don't know what else you could possibly put in this jar." And he says, "I don't have anything else to put in this jar. But this jar represents what's most important in your life. The rocks represent what's most important in your life. The sand and the water are those things that are not important. Put the rocks in the jar first, because if you put the sand and the water in the jar, you're not going to get every rock in that jar." So I decided, after 28 years of service, that one of the rocks that was most important to me was my daughter's future. And part of that was a reaction to my sister's suicide. So I retired from the Army. I moved to Florida. She went to high school there. She went to college there. She commuted from home. She graduated with honors from college. She got a part-time job while she was a student at Disney World. Some of your listeners may have been to Disney World. I don't know. She turned that into a full-time job at Disney World. She's now a lighting designer for Disney World. She's married. She owns her own home. Before coronavirus, she traveled all over the world. She's been very successful. She's very happy. Most of that is because of her, not because of me. I would give 98% of the credit to her, but 2% I give myself the credit by making sure that I put my priorities in life in the jar first, and her success, her future was important to me. One more story. I had a friend that went to the military academy at West Point. It's the premier military academy that trains people to go into the Army. And every year they have a reunion, and students from years back come back to meet with their classmates from decades ago. And this friend of mine was a retired colonel who retired at about 28 years service, I think it was. He told me this story recently. He said, "I went back to a reunion and I saw across the room, sitting at the bar, a retired 3-star general who was a friend, was my classmate at West Point, and he was by himself. So I went over to him. We'll call him John. I went over to him. I said, "Hey, John, how you doing?" And when John turned and looked at him, he could see there was watery eyes. He had misty eyes. And my friend didn't know whether that was because he had had too much to drink or it was because something was bothering him. And he said, "Are you okay?" And this retired 3-star general said, "You know, I gave 37 years of my life to the Army, and the Army rewarded me with command and promotions and wonderful assignments. And along the way, my wife left me, and my kids won't talk to me." So think about that a moment. Back up a couple of decades. What rocks did he put in his jar he put his career rocks in his jar and he left a family rock out. And he may not have even known that he was doing that at the time. He didn't recognize the sacrifices that he was putting his family through by working so hard to succeed in the military. And he was rewarded with promotions and command and everything else. Now he's a retired 3-star general who has no family to turn to. So for your listeners, put the right rocks in the jar first. It could be your health, it could be your family, it could be your job, it could be making a lot of money, it could be your faith, it could be a combination of those things. But figure out what's most important in your life and put those in the jar first. Now, I forgot your question, Vishram. So I don't know if I answered it. If I didn't, tell me and I'll go back into that direction.
No, you absolutely did. You absolutely did. And Anton has a rather important follow on to that.
Okay.
Just I'm going to take you back a little bit where you earlier on mentioned about Whelden on Whelden, and I'm guessing
sure.
That is kind of setting the expectations right from the very beginning. But on that note, what I'd really like to find out, and we have this within organizations as well, when we have new leaders taken on at different stages, they set their goals. And goal setting becomes an important part of that exercise. But what I am keen to find out is, if that is a practice that you followed, and is there such a thing as setting goals too high or too far-fetched, where you have a risk of not being able to meet up to it? How do you handle a situation like that?
Yeah, great question. Let me tell another story. I have a chapter in my book called How Tall Is Your Ladder? And it's a metaphorical story. So you have to imagine this. You have to be able to translate it. 35 years ago, when I was a major, I attended a school at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and I was a major, and there were probably 800 students in the course, and it was a one-year course. And towards the end of the course, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the very senior guy in the Army, came out to talk to the class. And he gave a presentation in a big auditorium, and at the end, he took questions. And a major raised his hand, and he asked the following question. He said, "General, how do you define success in today's Army? Is it battalion command? Is it making lieutenant colonel? Is it getting to a retirement after 20 years? What is a measurement of success in today's Army?" And the general thought for a moment, and he said, "You know, most of you probably think that I've been pretty successful." And we all thought, duh, of course you've been successful. And he says, "I'm a 4-star general. I'm the Chief of Staff of the Army. I'm the senior guy in the Army. So most of you probably think I'm been successful. But there's another 10 or so 4-star generals in the Army that have different jobs, that if they were in my shoes and they retired as the Chief of Staff of the Army, they would be disappointed." And we all thought, how can that possibly be? And he said, the reason is because a career in the military, and quite frankly, any career and a journey through life, is like climbing a ladder. When you start out, you're standing at the bottom of a ladder and you reach out and you grab the first rung on the ladder, and your feet are still on the ground, and it's not that difficult. And you reach that first rung, and for me as an Army officer, that was when I got commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant coming out of Purdue University. The next rung up on that ladder is 1st lieutenant. The next rung above that is captain, and so on and so forth. I'm climbing this corporate ladder, this military ladder, over time. But as you climb that ladder, the rungs will be further apart. You will be tired because you've been climbing. The air will be thinner, so it's harder to breathe. And then sometimes you will find yourself standing on a rung of the ladder, high in the air, and the next rung is out of reach. And the only way you're going to get to that rung is by jumping, taking a great risk, and then grabbing that. And hopefully you grab it and you don't fall off the ladder. So what was his point? His point was, every one of you in the audience today have a last rung on your ladder somewhere. And it's probably not at the very top, because very, very few people can get to the top of the ladder. So set a goal, strive to achieve that goal, and when you get there, be satisfied. Anything after that is gravy. Anything after that is icing on the cake. And I thought, that's pretty good advice. What do I want to do? What's my goal? I want to be a battalion commander. And for me to be a battalion commander in charge of 1,000 soldiers, I need to get through 2 more rungs on my ladder. I need to get promoted to lieutenant colonel, then I need to get selected for command. And that happened a couple of years later. And everything that happened after that, I said to myself, this is icing on the cake. This is beyond what I set my goals. And so if I retire or I leave tomorrow and I don't get the next promotion, that's okay, because I reached the last rung on my ladder. Now that story illustrates setting reasonable goals and not being disappointed if you don't get past those. I have counseled as a mentor several colonels in the Army and the Marine Corps who thought they should be generals, and they didn't get selected to be a general. And when they retired as full colonels in the Army or the Marine Corps, they were disappointed and they were bitter. And some of them carried that bitterness with them for years afterwards. And what I would tell them is, you had a hugely successful career in the military. Find another ladder to climb. Find another ladder to climb. And I'll tell you that today is my 69th birthday. I turned 69 today. And a year ago, I found a new ladder to climb. So at age 68, I decided I'm going to be an author and a speaker. And I started at 68 years old at the bottom of a new ladder, because sometimes it's about the journey. It's not all about the destination. Now, when I got done with that chapter, after I drafted that chapter, I thought, let me think a moment. Let me do an after-action review on that chapter. Yes. And my conclusion was, there will be some people out there that will read into this chapter that I am suggesting that you not strive to be the best you possibly can be. And that's not what I'm saying. So I wrote another chapter that immediately follows that one, and it's called the 1% Advantage. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, there are some people who strive to be the very best they possibly can be in their field. World-class athletes who go to the Olympics and win a gold medal is an example. Actors or actresses that win an Academy Award or a Grammy or one of these things. Politicians who climb their ladder and become the president of the United States, or the president of any country. All of those people have tremendous ambition, but sometimes it comes with tremendous risks. And the example I gave of the 3-star general at the West Point reunion who lost his family while climbing that ladder because he wanted to get to the top of his ladder is an example of that. I write in my book, in that chapter, about Michael Phelps. I don't know if you all know who Michael Phelps is, or your listeners. He's won more gold medals at the Olympics in swimming than any athlete in history.
True.
And he did a program. Do you get HBO in Sri Lanka? So any of your listeners who have HBO can go to HBO and they can watch a show that was produced by Michael Phelps. And the name of the show, I have it written down here a moment, let me find it. Oh, it's called The Weight of Gold. The Weight of Gold. And that's a metaphorical title that means basically that gold medal, those gold medals that I'm wearing around my neck are very, very heavy and came with a tremendous price. And in that documentary, he talks about Olympic athletes who have become gold medal winners had their 15 minutes of fame in the 30 seconds it took them to do whatever it is they do, or the 2 minutes, or the 42 minutes, or whatever it is they did to be the best they possibly can be. And then that was the culmination of what they had prepared for their entire life. Now, what was life like after that? And for many of them, for most of them, it was not going on to continued fame at 20 years old. It went downhill from that point on. They didn't get monetary rewards from it. They didn't get the fame that they had during that one Olympic. And so his point was, he even considered suicide at one time, as did many of his others. Olympic athletes go through tremendous depression when they're not able to achieve their goals, and sometimes even when they are able to achieve their goals. And for anybody who's striving to be in the 1% advantage over the 99% of the rest of us, just recognize that sometimes it comes with tremendous sacrifice.
I'm conscious of time, and I hate to kind of bring things to a close, but I guess all good things must come to that. Summing it all up, I think the book is a fantastic read, and I don't want to kind of give too much of it away. If it is possible for you to kind of summarize maybe a succinct few little droplets of wisdom for any young person who's just starting out in their careers, in their lives, what would you tell them, having gone through an illustrious career, gone through the ups and downs, and now, as you say, giving it forward for the next set of generations to come? What would you tell them succinctly to as they prepare for life?
I think the aspects of character that I mentioned earlier, humility, trust, integrity, honesty, empathy, self-awareness, particularly for senior leaders, meaning they need to recognize what their own flaws are. And sometimes they can't look in the mirror and see that. The emperor wears no clothes and he doesn't know it. All the character traits that I mentioned earlier that I write about in my book are incredibly, incredibly important. I think the aspect of character is so important that when I got done with the first chapter, I even recommended a second book on character that people read if they want to dive deeper into that. There is a famous American basketball coach named John Wooden. Most of your listeners probably have not heard of him, but he was one of the most famous collegiate basketball coaches in our history. He one time said, and I put this quotation at the front of my chapter on character, he once said, "Talent is God-given, be humble. Fame is man-given, be grateful. Conceit is self-given, be careful." Let me say that one more time. Talent is God-given, be humble. Fame is man-given, be grateful. Conceit is self-given, be careful. And I think that pretty much sums up how people should be.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was fantastic. I think that is a very, very poignant close. And with that, I'll pass it on to Anton.
Well, we were in conversation with Major General Craig Whelden, U.S. Army retired, a global Fortune 500 speaker, a 3-time award-winning #1 international best-selling author. And this is an hour designed to bring in inspiration through the backstories of modern-day leaders. On that note, all the way from Sri Lanka, wishing you a happy birthday. And thank you, sir, for spending some of that time with us. I can honestly say that this hour has been a thrilling one indeed. What stories and what moments in time, what inspiration, an amazing takeaway in all of that. To our audience, thank you for staying tuned in. I hope you enjoyed this segment as much as we did. We do have another interesting personality lined up for a segment next week. Do watch our social media space for the links to join in. If you've missed parts of this conversation, do not worry, it will be up on our YouTube channel. Do visit, subscribe, and hit that notification button to stay updated, and do remember to share. A quick shout out to our technology partners, H1, going strong with our 3rd season. Thank you for being with us. And with this, I bid you a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe, stay productive.